name's Michelle. I'm a member of Parliament in Canada, so roughly the equivalent of a congresswoman here. And what I want to talk to you tonight about is what I think are some opportunities to really disrupt how government operates in the space that you're working in. But what I wanted to enlighten you with a little bit is some of the challenges that I face as a legislator, and then maybe just open up the floor in terms of perhaps Q&A, but more of a call to action. So I'll start with a little bit about who I am and what I do. I represent a district in Calgary, Alberta, so in Western Canada. If any of you have had the privilege of skiing in Banff, I know we're in Colorado right now and you're all good and that sort of stuff, but I would like to say that my homeland is pretty awesome as well. So it's in Western Canada. My province has a big oil and gas-based economy. And in the last several years in Canada, we've seen a big disruption in our economy, in our confederation, and a polarization of politics that, and the reason why I bring that up is that what's happening in the US, we're not immune to it either, except that our political discourse has been, some of these issues have been exacerbated by regionalization in our country. But let's fast forward to what I do. I'm operating as the vice chair for the Standing Committee on Industry. I am the shadow minister for industry and economic development in Canada, and it's a huge portfolio. But one of the main areas that it deals with is telecommunications, data, and privacy. Prior to entering politics, I worked in technology commercialization. I managed the intellectual property portfolio, roughly speaking, of a major Canadian university, some of their sponsored research. So how I've tried to approach legislation and legislative approach in Canada is rather than saying, just listening to what bureaucrats might say, this is the way you should do it, is always asking, what is the public policy outcome, and is this the best way of doing it? Which, in and of itself, is a novel way of looking at political outcomes. So, in recent years in Canada, we've had a problem develop that has sort of spurred some of these regional tensions, and it relates to data and access to data. In Canada, access to data in and of itself, just like access to the internet, is run by 3 large incumbent companies. We pay roughly 5 times more for access to data than you do in the United States. Many Canadians actually come down to the United States to get data plans. And as we see in our economy regionalization become more and more acute, and people have less and less access to data and opportunity, we're actually starting to see economic contraction due to that. So at the same time, we're also trying to look at the issues that many American legislators are looking at here, which is, what about data privacy? So as we near the horizon of a 5G operating environment in Canada, where we have an oligopoly of people who are providing, or incumbents that are providing access to internet, we have a highly regionalized economy that's starting to become polarized, and we also have these privacy concerns. These are now becoming issues that are of imports to parliamentarians. The problem is nobody understands them, number one. And number two, the reaction from government to address these issues has been regulate. So I'm coming to you, I think, at a really critical juncture of my nation's history, in that we just had a major report issued. It had taken about a year for the government to write on what to do with these problems writ large. And what came forward, if you want to enlighten yourself, it's called the Yeats Report. It's this state of the Canadian telecom communication industry and the state of data and privacy, especially post-GDPR. It is pedantic down to the point of proposing things like this. To combat fake news, it suggested that the government regulate what media sites could be called media sites, and that anybody who wanted to post a quote-unquote news article needed to get a link from a state-approved media operator. That was a bit of a shock. But moreover, the approach to data and data privacy was to expand our regulator to vast proportions with legislation that was less effectual than GDPR, but more pedantic, and is going to cost a lot of money. So in the last several weeks, we have myself and a couple of other colleagues have tried to take a different approach, because the government is proposing to take parts of this report and promulgate it into legislation, which I think would just really disadvantage Canada from an economic growth perspective. So what we're suggesting is actually to start implementing some of the bills that, if you're familiar with Radical Exchange, the Data Dignity Act, we're starting to look at ways to actually put this into legislation so that people can evaluate their privacy rather than government controlling it in a pedantic, non-enforceable manner. So that's the challenge. This is what we're trying to do. Here's the problem I'm having right now. Nobody understands what I'm talking about at all. Not even a clue. Trying to talk to colleagues about this, and I'm not trying to be condescending or arrogant. It's just people fundamentally do not understand this space, which makes it very difficult to translate it to get political opinion such that there is a desire to legislate or a desire to do something different. So, for example, something as basic as trying to, for example, I was talking to Shiv over dinner, saying that I had to spend an hour and a half with a colleague trying to explain what the difference between Libra and Bitcoin was, because they thought it was all the same thing, right? Fundamentally trying to understand that data has a productive value, that yes, that's how Facebook makes money, it's something that is not in the electorate's public consciousness. It's not something that you can easily translate at the door. And so I guess what I wanted to talk to you tonight and really get advice and feedback was, how do we take some of these concepts that can disrupt the way that government works right now? If we're talking about, data cooperatives or quadratic financing or quadratic voting as ways to engage and re-envision democracy, how do we take those concepts and put them into a space that the average voter can understand? How do we take what you're doing here and port it such that it has some saleability and that what we're doing is not just transactional? So this is a highly innovative space. There's really not a lot of literature about how we take this and make it a political movement. I think when I look around the world at peers that have tried to do this, I think the Lib Dems in the UK tried slightly to do this. Labour Party slightly tried this. Even the concept of cooperatives doesn't really have a partisan home. That's really, I think, what groups like yourself need to do with folks like myself, folks that were just on the stage here, is really provide ways and means of us as politicians becoming translators of what you're doing and the value that it can provide to the public. So, for example, I can walk you through what we're trying to do right now with the, I'm not sure we're going to call it the Data Dignity Act in Canada, but we're trying to take those concepts and port it into legislation. The problem is that it doesn't neatly overlay on the existing legislative structure in Canada. It's like, I always say that making legislation is both additive and subtractive. You have to add legislation, you also have to change it. Sometimes you have to delete things. How do we do that within the existing political structure? So we've been working on this bill for a couple of months now. And it's been a challenge, not just from the perspective of writing the legislation, but trying to translate it through a parliament that just fundamentally doesn't understand the space. At the same time, we've been trying to stave off the government putting, $1 billion into, they're calling it a data commissioner. So they're actually looking at setting up another arm of government specifically to manage data. Like, for example, one of the proposals in this report was essentially they wanted Netflix to hand over their algorithm and their all of their IP on what's coming up on your front screen to the Canadian government, which is just like ridiculous. But trying to explain to somebody why that's ridiculous is part of the problem as well. So we look, I've looked to the European Union in terms of the success and failures of the GDPR. There's not a lot of overlap that we've seen to date in terms of being able to port it over into some of these new mechanisms like data cooperatives. And I'm looking to you for Q&A on how we should do this and what are some of the bright spots that legislators can put in place in terms of explaining these concepts in a politically saleable mechanism. I think where we've had some success is that we've had a lot of media coverage in the last couple of weeks on the concept of data being a property right. But that in and of itself has some connotations that are difficult to port into like a cooperative model, et cetera. I guess I'll just close with a bright note. I think that I think this is happening organically anyways. I think that the structure is changing around government in a positive way that's benefiting the average person on the street. The problem is that how do we stop the overregulation that I think is about to come both in my country and here in the United States? When you talk about antitrust legislation, more regulation, it's very difficult as a legislator to get to that point. So I guess, I usually give a 30-minute dissertation on this, but I'm in a room of people that are far smarter than I am on working in this space, and I'd just like to open a dialogue up with you on the mic on any questions that you might have on what it's like to be a legislator dealing with these topics, but also any suggestions that you have on best practice or how to communicate these concepts such that they might become part of a federal campaign or a local campaign in terms of political conversation. I think there's a mic. There's a floor mic there that I was told was turned. Sound guys, I was supposed to be like, yes, sound guys, good. So if you want, up at the front there, if you want to grab it.
All right. Hi, I'm Chelsea.
Again.
Hi. Happy birthday again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I just turned 40.
Woohoo!
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I made it.
So you mentioned that legislators need help understanding these things. What do you think is the best way for us to help from the outside in or the inside out?
What I'd like to see is a couple of tangible pilot projects that the electorate can interact with in a very transactional way, so that what we're talking about isn't abstract, right? For example, and we were talking about this at dinner, in Canada we have something called the Canadian Media Fund, which was a fund that was put in place probably 10, 15 years ago to fund quote-unquote Canadian content, and by that I mean shows, television shows, etc. That funding is doled out by bureaucrats in a highly lobbied environment in one part of the country, and it actually, in some ways, while it was well-intentioned, it excludes diverse voices, it excludes intersectional voices, and it also really doesn't produce stuff necessarily that people want. So, could we take a small fraction of that funding and somehow, put together a QF model where we're piloting citizens getting government keys, et cetera, similar to what's happening in Estonia, but where somebody's actually interacting with a decentralized system of government. I think that would be helpful. I'm just not sure where we would go to look for something like that. I know there's Gitcoin, that sort of stuff, but how do we scale that up? How could that be ported onto an existing government stream?
Do you think, it sounds like there's a couple of steps before that are maybe educational?
Sure.
So how do you think that happens?
I mean, for those of you who watched the Zuckerberg Senate hearing, I mean, to me that was a wake-up call for me as a legislator, even though it was in a different country, just because of the questions that were coming out of the Senate committee were things that you could Google, right? So they're legislators, if I was in that situation, I would be asking precise pieces of information that aren't publicly available, that are material to legislation. And there's just such a lack of knowledge on just the basics of a platform like Facebook, right? So if you look at the lack of knowledge and the knowledge gap between legislators, and this is, it's not just, I don't want to paint our legislature as old. It's, even among, young legislators, I think that just basic understanding of what decentralization means, right? Most people have no clue. I would say 95% of my broader colleagues in Parliament have no clue what a blockchain is at all, none, zero. So, are there forums or ways to get members of the community in front of legislators who are open, who might have political philosophies too that don't necessarily want to rely on regulation? How do we show that there are, how do we educate that there are different ways of doing this? And I struggle finding resources to point to my colleagues, and I struggle in explaining these concepts as well, right? I'm not a subject matter expert, but I know just enough to sound dangerous. So I think that's number one, is the community producing resources that can explain this in a way beyond a YouTube video that, you get lost 30 seconds in.
Right. Huh. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks. Someone, oh, yeah.
Go on. Go ahead. No, go on.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a company called everythingprivate.io. We're basically trying to decentralize data, so this is a very relevant conversation.
Yes.
My question is, what do you think of the CCPA, and what do you think it does right, and what do you think it doesn't do so right? If you could sort of generalize.
I mean, in the Canadian context, I think we're not even in a point where we're able to answer that question adequately. I know that sounds very juvenile, but I think what I would say is the desired future state that we would measure that against is whether or not somebody can evaluate their own privacy, whether or not they can derive value from their data in a meaningful way that's easy to port and easy to interact with. And this is my political philosophy coming through, but that there's a limited role in government, a limited role for government in that. I would look to you. I mean, I think that this space is so new from a legislative perspective that me coming back to you on what it gets right and what it gets wrong, I almost feel unqualified to answer that. I'm sitting on the stage, typically I'm the first person who'll give up a 20-minute barn burner in the House of Commons. But I feel like what politicians need to be doing right now is listening to the community and saying okay, this has been my experience in starting up a company in this space. It's doing what you want to do in terms of public policy outcome, but here's where the structures are failing right now. So I know that that's not an adequate response, but I guess what I wanted to do here tonight more than anything, because I've been working with Radical Exchange and other people, was really open up a dialogue with the community in a more formal way. We need help. We have no idea what we're doing, right? Across political stripe, across government. And I think, founders like yourself actually need to come up and start. I'll put it this way. I don't think there's been a single lobbyist in Canada from a company like yours in any political office space. Meanwhile, incumbents that are making money off of an existing status quo or would, based on, a even more stringent regulatory environment, are in our offices. So you tell me, I guess, and then how do we port that into a regulatory / legislative framework that allows you to do what you're doing properly? I don't know. That was totally a shitty answer, but like, I genuinely feel like there's so much runway to do, like, to really change the political narrative, to change the political economy in this space, and it's just not translating. And I'm living in this space right now where it's just like, oh.
I guess if I could ask one more question, it would be, what is the problem with the current data ecosystem, if you could sort of boil it down to its essence?
First of all, the line I've been using is that nobody in my country anyways has rights to the inherent value of their data. So to me, that's the problem, because if we're starting from the perspective that you don't have rights to your data and it's the government's role simply to regulate that, then that's a very binary path forward, and it stymies the work that you're doing, right? So to me, that's the greatest challenge I'm facing as a legislator, is just saying, like, how we've been trying to communicate in this space is, nobody would work for free. Your labor has productive value, so why? In many cases, I would say somebody's data almost may have more productive value than their data or than their labor. Why are we not valuing it the same way? And to me, that's the biggest problem. Is that, and the other thing is that that concept is not enshrined in any sort of international structure that's globally portable, right? It's even the concept itself is highly balkanized. So it's difficult. I would assume it's difficult for you to operate or thinking about how you would scale up your company or how you would govern it. Talking to people that are trying to come up with data cooperatives, I think, cross-border governance is a problem, especially if you're trying to monetize it. And I think that if we can get one or two countries that's getting that legislative framework right and able to implement it, it would open up a whole new market that we could have a lot more investment in. I guess, and sorry, one last question too is, just talking to a few colleagues here, I also think that people look at the data ecosystem as like a traditional business model, like it's like they're trying to port some of these things to like a traditional sort of VC deal, and that's not how it works, right? So that's part of the problem as well.
Hi, nice to meet you. Question for you. What do you think of the idea of offering bug bounty solutions for legislation itself? So what I'm trying to say is, like, what about democratizing solutions, like offering bounties for people to solve legal code and regulations, like kind of like a cooperation of legal analysts, data scientists to see the impacts of that legislation and whatnot?
I'm so glad you brought this up because, okay, this is sort of highly provocative, but in an ideal future state, I shouldn't have a job, right? In that, we have the framework and the capability right now. We have the capability in theory of having a direct democracy, right? We just haven't really thought about how we implement that. And how do I feel about that? I think that's awesome. Like, if you look at the level of, in any given week in my parliament, there's 5 or 6 different bills being debated. There's $1 billion plus of new expenditures we have to review. It's like physically impossible for me to review everything that I vote on, right? It's impossible because government's become so ubiquitous. So if I represent 120,000 people, and I'm just trying to figure out where I'm putting my attention and what I'm advocating for, it's very inefficient. right? Like, I think in an ideal future state, the decentralization of government, and oftentimes when people hear that, they think about, devolution of federal to like state or federal to provincial powers. We should really be saying, like, how can we, civic advocacy shouldn't just be about, or civic engagement shouldn't just be about encouraging people to vote for an elected representative. It should be to do the things that you're talking about. Absolutely. And in a country, the reason why I started with my talk off by talking about how regionalized Canada has become is I actually think that that's one of the ways that we can keep our confederation together is paradoxically by decentralizing some of these decisions so that you don't get the same sort of regional disparity. And I think you feel it here in the US too. But I think, to me, that sort of concept that you're talking about, it transcends partisan boundaries. It because we're talking about a new framework for democracy that's really cool. But again, to the point that was made earlier, we have to have some tangible pilots of these things so that people see that this is in the public's best interest.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Welcome to Colorado.
I love Colorado. Yes.
So I'll preface this by saying I'm running for Congress.
Yes.
What caused me to pull the trigger was watching the House Committee on Banking and Finance question Facebook over Libra and realizing not a single one of them knew anything about banking or finance.
Exactly.
Do you know of anybody, whether they're in the Canadian Parliament or the U.S. Congress or Senate or any other country nearby, who might be allies for you, people who at least are willing or open-minded to listen and learn a little bit? If you can get people who have, it seems to me that if you can get people, not just a single country, who have some knowledge, now you can talk to each other. You can come up with ideas. You can take those ideas back to your own government and say, here's what we're doing.
I think Radical Exchange is doing a great job of that. Glenn Weil, others, Vitalik, that are involved in the Democracy Earth. I know that some of the folks are here. That I think is starting to become a catalyst for legislators. It didn't start in the legislator community, but we end up bumping, into each other, and then it's like, oh, this is really cool. So I think that group has done a great job. I'm trying to, in Canada, start like a group of allies that are nonpartisan on this, that are across our House of Commons as well as our Senate committees. So we're actually starting. I met with a senator who wants to take the lead on this on his side of the legislature, and we're going to start an interparliamentary working group on this. But again, like your point on Libra versus Bitcoin, our dinner conversation was like, you actually have to explain to people how cash works to understand the difference, right?
Yes.
And you have to even go back to bartering. Like, I have a pig, you have a cow. How do we know that I now have the pig and you now have the cow, right? So it's like...
What do you mean our money's based on debt?
But at the same time, I think that there's another way of looking at it, which is very much this. Sometimes I don't need to know how it works. I just need to know how it affects my life and if it's good or bad. Right. And I think that that's where the intersection of between what your community is doing and what we're trying to do in the legislature is. We just need to take it up from the weeds and actually start talking about the fact that there are different ways of managing a society that we are now technologically enabled to do that people just haven't really had the courage to talk about yet, or the knowledge. So, I would say that the more that we can get these platforms into public and popular political discourse, the better. And good for you for running. Awesome, boss. Go for it. I think we're done. One more question or one more question? Yeah.
All right. That kind of changes things, I guess. So as a last question, because you talked a lot about education.
Yes.
So my experience, the higher up in government you go, the more expensive, the more longer-winded, and the more frustrating it actually gets to work with government. If you go from municipality to province to...
Yeah.
So, and usually what ends up happening is you have a large conglomerate that end up shaping policy. So if the telecoms are hoarding all the data, somehow, some way, the CTO of Bell shapes the policy. So 2 questions within one. A, how does funding get unlocked for education? And how do startups that maybe not have as such market reach as a conglomerate get to have a voice at the table to actually educate the policymakers that would benefit from their knowledge?
Sure. That's such a great point, and it really goes to the complexity and the closeness of the lobbyist and legislative world. I mean, it's not as bad in Canada. I shouldn't say this in the United States. I feel like it's a little more intense in the United States. How about that? I'm married to an American, so yay. Part of it is just poking into the world that this happens in, right? I think that there needs to be more formal advocacy groups. You know, we're talking about data cooperatives. We need to have cooperatives of people that are wanting to advocate for change in this direction that are actually becoming lobbyists. I mean, but at the same time, I think that the system is being disrupted, right? So it's about marrying those examples of where disruption is happening and turning legislators' attentions on that with intent. So, I mean, Libra is a good example of that. Libra just kind of popped out of nowhere. It got a lot of people's attention. That is an opportunity for, you know, collectives of startup owners. You need associations, essentially, right, that are coming into people's offices, that are interacting with groups like the one that we're trying to put together in Canada, such that there's not only one binary policy choice that's coming up. And I know that sounds really crass and not cool, but you can't beat the game if you're not going to play the game to a certain extent, right? And I would just say play the game, right? But knowing that there are people that want something different, that understand fundamentally that there has to be change. So this is the weirdest talk I've ever given. I'm going to be honest with you. But I just want to extend an invitation. Talk to us, call us, get in front of your congressmen and find allies. I think that is the perfect way to describe this, and tell us what to do. Please don't assume that we have any idea what you're talking about, because we don't. And come into our offices. And thank you for all the work you're doing, too, in Canada on this. Thank you.